Quite a few warships would see service through both world wars. More than it might seem at first glance if you just look at capital ships and not smaller warships. Most of the more famous ships, such as Warspider Texas, served through the wars because of the treaty era preventing replacements for them. This is not always the case, though, and some ships simply endured because they were in smaller navies that couldn't replace them even if they weren't limited by treaty. The curious case of SMS Niobe fits this alternative explanation perfectly. In this ship, you have an Imperial German cruiser of the late 1890s that would, through changing hands and navies multiple times, survive right up into the middle of World War II. In the process of this, she would ultimately see service in 3 different iterations of the German Navy, along with serving in Yugoslavia and Italy. While she wouldn't end up in any famous engagements or the like, 43 years of service are nothing to ignore. That being said, her humble roots gave no indication this would happen. Laid down as the second of the Gazelle class light cruisers, Niobe was a small ship, yet a pioneering one. Her class would set the standard for Imperial German light cruisers going forward, being intended to merge colonial cruisers with fleet scouts. This required a relatively fast and fairly heavily armed cruiser with good range. For the turn of the 20th century, these ships were a good swing at that concept. However, such was the march of technology that they were largely obsolete by the time the Great War actually kicked off. For her part, Niobe was laid down on August 30th, 1898, and launched a little less than a year later on July 18th, 1899. She would proceed through her fitting out process and enter service on June 25th, 1900, joining the Imperial German fleet as, for the time, one of their most modern ships. She displaced roughly 3,000 tons at her full loading, which seems small to modern eyes, being not much heavier than, for example, a Fletcher, but it is fairly average for her era. On that tonnage, she carried 10 10.5cm, 4.1-inch guns, and 2 45cm, 17.7-inch torpedo tubes. In classic protected cruiser style, her armor protection was what armor, at least in relation to any sort of belt. Instead, she had a 25mm, roughly an inch thick, armored deck for protection. Her 8 boilers could produce about 8,000 indicated horsepower, which could get her up to 21.5 knots on 2 screws. This was actually a fairly fast speed for her day, as these things go. And now, with that done, let's talk about service history that I alluded to earlier. As one could perhaps expect, her initial career was a quiet one. Properly joining the German fleet in 1901, Niobe would spend most of her early service on training missions and port visits. She would, off and on again, serve as a torpedo boat flagship through 1903, with the most interesting fact here probably being that one Franz von Hipper served as her commanding officer during this period. He would leave her for a torpedo boat, however, as the cruiser shifted over to 1st Scouting Group in March 1903, where she would remain until decommissioning for an overhaul in late September of 1904. She would remain in that overhaul through 1905 and into the summer of 1906, coming back into service in June. Now, from her entrance back into service in June 1906 through January 1909, she served with the East Asia Squadron. This was, much like her previous time in active service, quiet and uneventful. Not that it wasn't tiring for the ship and her crew, though, as she was so badly worn out upon return to Germany that she was decommissioned again within a couple weeks of her return. This is fairly typical for cruisers of the time, really, in the serving on foreign station until completely worn out turns. A similar thing happened to the original Cormoran, as I covered in a previous video. Now, as I said earlier in this video, her class as a whole was pretty quickly rendered obsolescent by advancements in technology. As a result, not even a decade after her completion, Niobe would spend the remaining years before the Great War in reserve. She would only be recommissioned when World War I kicked off in August 1914, and even then for coastal defense duty. That was, in its own right, short-lived. By September of 1915, she was already removed from even that service, with most of her crew pulled off for more modern and capable warships. For the remainder of the war, she would serve as a headquarters ship for various commanders, including such names as Ludwig von Reuter, more famous for scuttling the High Seas Fleet, and her old commanding officer, Admiral Hipper. This hardly necessitated her actually leaving port, though, so in 1917 her guns were pulled off and used for harbor defense. She would remain in port for the rest of the war, avoiding any sort of combat, and ultimately being decommissioned again on February 3, 1919. This would probably have been where her story ended, as she was definitely obsolete at this point, and would have been target practice for any competent modern light cruiser. Of course, much as with the similarly obsolete pre-dreadnoughts, that wasn't meant to be. Niobe was one of the ships Germany was allowed to keep under the Treaty of Versailles, so she was rearmed and returned to service with the new Reichsmarine. In an effort to keep her at least somewhat relevant to modern combat, she was heavily modernized. Her ram bow was replaced with a clipper bow, and her 10.5cm guns were replaced with more modern guns of the same type. She also had two 50cm torpedo tubes fitted in place of her old mounts. Even with this refit, though, there was no getting around her age. Her service with interwar Germany would be short, as she was sold to the new Kingdom of Yugoslavia in 1925. Here she would remain for most of her remaining career, now on to her third navy. That being said, the thing to remember here is that Yugoslavia, technically the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes at the time, didn't have a lot of money or naval infrastructure. The great ports of Austria-Hungary were taken by Italy, and the same could be said for the ex-Austro-Hungarian ships that Yugoslavia expected to receive. Without much of a navy to call their own, even such an outdated ship as Niobe must have seemed appealing. So when the Germans were looking for someone to buy her, Yugoslavia took the offer. Unfortunately, Germany wasn't exactly allowed to export warships at the time, so all those fancy new guns had to be pulled off first. Taking the opportunity that opened up, the Yugoslavs would rebuild her again and convert her to a training cruiser. This was probably a better role for her at this point in time, if one is being honest. Renamed to Dalmatia, I'm not even going to try butchering the Yugoslav pronunciation here, she entered into Yugoslavian service in the late 1920s. There is some debate on exactly what she was equipped with at this point, which isn't terribly surprising with how record-keeping was for smaller nations. The general consensus seems to be 6 guns, though the exact kind of gun is debated. Was it 8.5cm guns, or 8.6cm, or were they 8.3cm? Sources differ here, though they all tend to agree on it at least being 6 guns of some general 3-inch caliber. No matter the exact details of her weaponry at this point, Dalmatia would spend her Yugoslavian service on training duty, specifically gunnery training. In 1930, she received another refit that gave her a tripod mast, though her role remained the same. Through the 1930s, she undertook multiple training cruises and spent several stints as flagship as well. This would probably have been the extent of her career, if not for the Second World War. Yugoslavia was invaded by the Axis powers in April 1941, and Dalmatia would stay in port and see no action. Unsurprising for a 40-year-old ship. She spent the course of the invasion as a harbor defense vessel once again, before the Yugoslav surrender saw her change hands again. This time, the Italians took her into their fleet, giving the old cruiser her third name, Cattaro. Not as much changed as you'd expect, other than her name and flag, though. The Italians continued to use her as a gunnery training ship, during the course of which she was attacked by the British submarine HMS Traveller, though fortunately for the antique workhorse, she wasn't hit by any of the torpedoes. She would remain in Italian service until 1943. At that point, she returned to German service and her old name. Now on to her fifth navy, depending on how you view the various German navies. Niobe was rearmed yet again. She had 6 8.4cm anti-aircraft guns, 4 47mm anti-aircraft guns, and 30 assorted 20mm cannon. Her German service, beginning in November of 1943, was a change of pace for the worn-out cruiser. She would now be on convoy escort duty, something her heavy, for her size and age, anti-aircraft weaponry was well suited for, at least in the Adriatic, where aircraft were more of a threat than ships. Unfortunately for her, that career would be very short-lived. On December 19, 1943, Niobe ran aground on the island of Silba. Within a few days, British torpedo boats hit the ship with 2 torpedoes, wrecking her to the point of not being worth salvaging. She would remain on that island, stripped of weapons and parts by various parties, for the rest of the war. It would only be in 1947 when proper salvage operations took place, and she would be raised and sold for scrap sometime between 1949 and 1952. Niobe didn't see much in the way of combat, but her story remains a fascinating one. She served in 3 to 5 navies, depending on the distinction one takes with the German navies. No matter how you view the different fleets, she did serve with every pre-Cold War iteration of the German Navy to some extent or another. For 43 years, this old and outdated cruiser performed her training roles admirably, and that's something to be respected. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.